You ever notice how every time the government says it's for your safety, something you own suddenly becomes illegal? Well, New York just proved that point again. Governor Kathy Hochul just signed off on a law that gives cops the green light to confiscate your guns on site. No warrant, no hearing, no due process. If they show up to a domestic call and somebody says they're scared, boom. Your firearms are gone before you can even finish your sentence. Now, they'll tell you it's about protection, about saving lives. But anyone who's watched how these things play out knows better. Once you hand the government the power to take property without a judge, you don't get that power back. This isn't a tweak to some red flag policy. This is a hard pivot into mandatory confiscation. It removes every bit of officer discretion. And that's where things get dangerous. Because when a politician decides fear equals justification, freedom doesn't just fade away. It gets hauled off in an evidence bag. And if it can happen in New York, you'd be crazy to think the rest of the country isn't watching and taking notes. So here's what's really going on. Under New York's brand new Assembly Bill A544B and Senate Bill S1985B, police no longer decide when to take your guns. The state just made that decision for them. It's all spelled out in a single word buried deep in the amendment. Shall. Officers shall seize any firearm when responding to a domestic or family-related call. That one word flips everything. It means there's no judgment call, no reading the room, no asking questions. If someone in that house says they're afraid, or if the cop believes the gun might pose a threat, your firearm is gone before the dust even settles. Now, the state tries to dress it up like it's temporary. They call it a 5-day cooling-off period. But don't let that fool you. The law sets a minimum of 120 hours, but never defines a maximum. That means your rifle, your handgun, your shotgun, even that heirloom revolver from your grandfather, can sit in a police locker for weeks while the paperwork crawls through the system. And it's not just firearms. Thanks to the vague way the bill cross-references state definitions, it can cover stun guns, electric dart devices, even imitation weapons. Basically, if it looks like it could go bang, it's fair game. The supporters say it's about stopping violence before it happens. But anyone who's been around law enforcement knows what this really does. It shifts the liability from the officer to you. Cops aren't going to risk their careers for a judgment call, so they'll just take everything. It's safer for them, not for you. That's the trade-off we're looking at. Safety theater for the headlines, and constitutional damage for the people actually following the law. Now, let's talk about what this means beyond the headlines. Because what New York just did doesn't stop at gun ownership. It cuts right through the core of due process and probable cause. On paper, they'll tell you the law still requires a reasonable belief and probable cause before a firearm gets seized. But anyone who's ever dealt with that system knows how flexible those words can get. Probable cause isn't some hard science. It's a judgment call. It's a feeling. And now that feeling decides whether your rights survive the night. Here's the problem. The Fourth Amendment was written to stop exactly this kind of thing, government taking property without a clear judicial review. But under this new rule, that review comes after the fact. By the time a judge even looks at it, your guns are already in the back of a cruiser. That's not justice. That's confiscation first, justification later. Then comes the 14th Amendment, due process. The state says you can file to get your guns back after 5 days. But 5 days in government time? That can easily stretch into weeks. And even if you do everything right, you've still got storage fees, paperwork, and a legal cloud hanging over your name. The worst part? There's no real penalty for getting it wrong. If an officer seizes your weapons without solid evidence, you don't get compensation, you don't get an apology, you just get your guns back whenever they decide you can have them. And that brings us to the Second Amendment. Bruin in 2022 reaffirmed the right to bear arms as an individual one, not a privilege handed out by the state. But this new mandatory confiscation approach treats ownership like a conditional benefit. It's saying, you can keep your guns until we feel nervous about it. That's not liberty. That's permission. And permission can be revoked any time the mood changes in Albany. Here's where it gets ugly. Because laws like this don't just live on paper. They hit real people fast. Picture this. Cops roll up to a domestic call. Things are tense, emotions high. Maybe it's a neighbor's complaint. Maybe it's just a loud argument. Somebody says, he's got guns in the house. That's all it takes. Now, instead of investigating or calming things down, the officers go straight for the safe. They're not thinking about fairness. They're thinking about liability, because if they don't take your firearms and something happens later, it's their badge on the line. So what do? They seize first and sort it out later. That's not law enforcement. That's risk management at the expense of liberty. And for you, the law-abiding citizen, the nightmare starts right there. Even if no charges are filed, your name is on record, your firearms are tagged as evidence, and you've got to jump through bureaucratic hoops to get them back. That means storage fees, transfer paperwork, background checks, and maybe even a court date, all for guns that were never used in a crime. You're guilty by assumption until you can afford to prove otherwise. And that's the dangerous part, because when the state makes it easier to take than to return, that system starts feeding on itself. People get discouraged. They stop reporting misunderstandings. They stop trusting law enforcement. That's not safety. That's fear disguised as policy. And if you think this is just a New York problem, think again. Other states are watching closely. All it takes is one governor saying, "It worked there," and suddenly the same rulebook shows up in Illinois, California, or New Jersey. That's how overreach spreads, not through a single sweeping federal law, but through 50 smaller ones, all heading in the same direction. Now, to be fair, not everybody sees this law as government overreach. Supporters say it's about saving lives, plain and simple. They'll tell you domestic violence calls are some of the most dangerous situations cops walk into, and that firearms make those encounters even riskier. They quote studies saying victims are 5 times more likely to be killed when an abuser has access to a gun. From that angle, a short-term confiscation sounds like a no-brainer. Groups like the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence are calling this a cooling-off period. They say pulling guns out of a tense household gives victims a few days to get safe, file restraining orders, or find help. And they point to that Rahim 2024 ruling, where the court allowed temporary disarmament in certain domestic cases. Even lawmakers in Albany are framing it as prevention, not punishment. If it saves one life, they say, it's worth it. And honestly, on the surface, it sounds compassionate. It sounds reasonable. But here's the problem with that argument. Good intentions don't erase bad precedent. Because history shows every single restriction that started as temporary eventually found a way to become permanent. That's the slope we're standing on, the one built out of sympathy and sold as common sense. Here's the truth about temporary laws. They never stay temporary. Every inch of power the government grabs during a crisis becomes a mile they'll keep after it's over. We've seen this play out time and time again. It starts with a promise. This is just precautionary. Then it becomes policy. Then it becomes the norm. The Second Amendment doesn't say, shall not be infringed unless someone gets nervous. The Fourth doesn't say, secure in your property, except when the state feels uneasy. And the 14th sure doesn't say, due process, unless there's a domestic argument. Those words were written as absolutes, because our founders knew once fear becomes law, freedom becomes permission, and permission can vanish overnight. Supporters keep saying, it's only 5 days. But anyone who's ever dealt with state bureaucracy knows 5 days on paper means 2 weeks in real life. And that's just to get an answer, not your property back. Meanwhile, your rights are on pause, your name's flagged, and your reputation's under a microscope. They call it prevention. But what it really does is normalize control. Today, it's a domestic call in New York. Tomorrow, it's a public safety concern in another state. And before long, it's nationwide. One regulation at a time, all dressed up as common sense. You don't protect liberty by trusting the same system that keeps chipping away at it. Because once the government learns it can take your guns without a warrant, it'll find new excuses to keep doing it. History's not subtle about that lesson. We just keep ignoring it. At first glance, New York's new gun custody law might look like a focused response to a tough problem. But the deeper you look, the more you realize it's not about violence. It's about control. Because every time the government gets to redefine what safety means, liberty loses ground. Nobody here is denying the reality of domestic violence. It's real, it's tragic, and it deserves real solutions. But confiscating property without a warrant or a hearing isn't justice. It's convenience. And once we let convenience decide where rights begin and end, those rights stop being rights. They become privileges handed out by politicians. The Constitution doesn't vanish because emotions run high or headlines get scary. The right to keep and bear arms, the right to due process, the right to be secure in your own home, those aren't outdated ideas. They're the guardrails that stop emotion from becoming law, and law from becoming tyranny. So if you think this ends in New York, think again. Other states are watching, and what starts as a 5-day safety rule could become the blueprint for national enforcement. That's why it matters to speak up now, while we still can. Freedom only survives when people are willing to defend it. Not just with words, but with vigilance. Because every right you fail to protect today becomes a regulation you'll be fighting tomorrow. Make sure you like, subscribe, and drop a comment down below. Stay sharp.